Hello, and welcome back to the Mathematicians Podcast, the show where we follow the fascinating stories behind the people that count in the history of mathematics. I'm your host, Benjamin Cornish, and today we're doing another double bill for a pair of mathematicians who were historical neighbours, and like all good neighbours, argued over petty differences and vied to have the best tended front garden. Nabu-rimanni and Kidinu, and their systems. But first, one thing that you learn when you run a gem and fossil shop is that there are two types of gemstones, the jaggedy type and the smooth type. Real gems, of course, are very expensive, so for the first few years of my shop, I mainly sold coloured glass. You could still polish coloured glass and make it smooth, or cut it in such a way that it looked like the pointy type of gem. Of course, neither type was exactly what a real gem looks like, but they were close enough that a passing tourist might mistake them for actual gems. And in some ways, as a gem shop, do you really need to be selling genuine crystals? Or is it enough to make people feel like they are walking away with a genuine crystal? Ultimately, people pay money in exchange for the belief that they are walking away with a crystal, and I happily provided that belief. You might say that those crystals have different properties than the cut glass I was providing, but I would argue that my cut, or indeed polished, glass offered exactly the same level of medicinal healing. Sometimes an approximation is good enough. I generally worked in the world of placebo, and I noticed that people tended to improve their symptoms if they believed they were using a good placebo, even if they were only using my glass imitation of a placebo. In this second series of the show, I said I would be focusing on the influential figures in the growing Indian tradition. I initially set out to include Persian thinkers in this bubble, as there was a lot of transfer of knowledge between the adjacent kingdoms. Today, I will be stretching the scope a little to include Babylon, which means we get to start today with one of my favourite games. How can I oversimplify 1,000 years of history, culture, and geography? Nabu-rimanni and Kidinu were both temple astronomers working in ancient Babylon, possibly the city of Babylon itself, or perhaps the other academic centres, Uruk. Nabu-rimanni, we believe, comes from the 5th century BCE, and Kidinu, we think, comes from the 4th century BCE. However, the exact dates are unknown. So let's take a minute, or 20, to discuss who the Babylonians were and where they fit into the wider picture. If we start by looking at a map on the internet, the first thing I'm sure we're all struck by is how much land there is outside of the wonderful United Kingdoms of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. In the first 50 episodes, we focused on the Hellenistic tradition, which included all of the islands in the Mediterranean, along with Spain, Italy, Greece, the coast of Turkey, and even some settlements on the very east coast of the Mediterranean around Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. However, on the coastline of Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, the Greek settlements were more like outposts and city-states, rather than vast tracts of land. As you move about 50 kilometres away from the coastline, from anywhere south of Syria, the fertility of the soil reduces as you get into the North Arabian desert. This suggests a natural geographic boundary between empires of the Mediterranean and empires of the Central Asian steppe. So where is Babylon, and who are the Babylonians? Ancient Babylon, now largely in ruins, is in Iraq, about 50 kilometres south of Baghdad. It is such an ancient city that I get to use one of my favourite sources of historical fact, the Book of Genesis. You might recall the famous Tower of Babel. This is a mythical tower in the post-flood period where the residents allegedly constructed a tower to try to get close to God. In the Akkadian language, the word for Babylon means gates to the god. This is Bab-ilu, the gate of God, and therefore Hebrew authors identified the gateway to the gods as a hubristic literal tower, which came crashing down and created linguistic diversity. In Hebrew, the word used is balal, which is to confuse or to mix up, as a pun on the word Babel, gateway to God. So, although the timeline of this is spurious, we see references to Babylon in later Hebrew writers. Traditionally, the Tower of Babylon is around 2 to 3000 BCE, although of course only written about in the 6th or 7th century BCE. I have some more Bible references for you later, but for now let's do a quick history from the founding of Babylon up to a more understandable modern day. Babylon is founded around 2000 BCE as a small Akkadian-speaking town, part of the Akkadian Empire. This empire existed largely between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates and is often considered to be the first known empire. At around 1900 BCE, Babylon starts to become its own place under Amorite rulers and reached a peak in 1700 BCE under Hammurabi. We like Hammurabi. He's the one who issued Hammurabi's Code, a treaty on law and justice, including the first known references to a presumption of innocence until proven guilty. I'm going to make a reference to a few different groups of people. So initially we have the Akkadians and now the Amorites, and we can think of them as tribal nomadic groups who established themselves in a location and became a stationary territory holder. Ethnically speaking, these groups are fairly similar, having all come from the same Semitic region. However, we note that their languages, cultures, and customs will be different, perhaps due to God confusing their languages after the Tower of Babel incidents. But from a history of science point of view, it's interesting to note that the Akkadians introduced the Akkadian cuneiform, which the Amorites adopted as their own when they created the empire. In 1595 BCE, the Hittites sacked the city as it had grown weak under Amorite rulers. They did not rule the city as the Hittite Empire, because the Hittite Empire was centered in Anatolia, so modern-day Turkey, and Babylon was just too far away to hold. So instead they destroyed it, nicked all the gold, and then left a power vacuum, which was stepped into by the Kassites. We're not entirely sure where the Kassi come from, but they ruled with stability for around 400 years. It is in this time that Babylon becomes a major religious, cultural, scientific, and political institution. In and around 1000 BCE, Babylon is technically ruled by native Babylonians, but with strong Assyrian influence. So the Assyrians had an empire in the North Arabian steppe, although their empire eventually extended to include all of Egypt. They were not a nomadic people, establishing their first permanent city-state capital, this is Assur, in 2500 BCE. This is a major ethnic group that persists to this day, along with a similar importance as ancient Egyptians, but with far fewer films made about them. For about 500 years of Assyrian dominance, the city of Babylon is repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt, depending on the whims of the various kings. In 626 BCE, the Babylonians catch a break as they control their own empire again. Babylon grows to become a massive city with major building works and reaches a peak under Nebuchadnezzar II. It is in this period that our mathematicians for today exist. But I'm going to keep telling the history story of Babylon a little bit longer, because in 605 BCE, we get back to the fun Bible bits. In 605, Nebuchadnezzar II defeats the Egyptians, which is quite the statement to make to the world about being a serious player, although this battle took place in Carchemish, which is currently just over the border in Turkey, near Lake Assad in Syria. So a little way outside of Egyptians' home turf. From here, though, Nebuchadnezzar marches south into Judah, the major Israelite kingdom, and captures Jerusalem. This is where we meet Daniel, of the Book of Daniel fame. Then we get a rebellion in Jerusalem, which Babylon puts down. We see this in Book 2 of Kings and in Ezekiel. Then another rebellion 7 years later with the destruction of the Temple of Solomon in the Book of Jeremiah and Lamentations. Now, broadly speaking, I'm not a big fan of the Old Testament, largely because I am a big fan of jurisprudence and feminism. However, as a history book, rather than a book of morals, The Old Testament has some screenplay level of storytelling. The book of Daniel is crying out for a biopic. We have Nebuchadnezzar creating a statue of himself and asking everyone to bow down. Daniel and friends choose not to and are thrown into a fiery furnace and survive. Nebuchadnezzar has dreams, and Daniel is on hand to interpret them. One of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams is of a statue with a head of gold, shoulders of silver, a body of bronze, and feet of clay, which falls over. A great metaphor for the various empires that build Babylon into what it is at this point in history. Oh, and hey look, another modern-day idiom, he stands on feet of clay. In another high-stakes scene, a new king, Belshazzar, has a feast with drink vessels looted from Solomon's temple. Now, this is a big insult to the Israelites, and therefore God, so a magic hand appears and writes on the wall, Mene Mene Tekel Parsin, which roughly translates to, God has numbered the days of your kingdom, you have been weighed and found wanting, your kingdom will be given to another tribe. Again, this is the origin of the famous phrase, the writing is on the wall. Then we get the big one, Daniel in the lion's den. At this stage in his imprisonment/career, Daniel is now a senior official under the rule of the new king Darius. His rivals trick the king into banning prayer, which Daniel ignores, so Darius reluctantly throws him into the lion's den. Yet another idiom. Obviously, Daniel survives because the hero of the story always has to survive. So, jumping back out of the Bible stories and back into the standard historical timeline, King Darius and the Achaemenid Empire steps into the field in 539. This empire was only founded 11 years earlier by Cyrus the Great. Before this, the people called themselves the Parsa, with a slightly nomadic territory of Parsua localized around Persis in modern-day Iran. If you were to mispronounce Persis and all of this in ancient Greek, you might say, oh wait, it's the Persians! Mene Mene Tekel Parsin. The clues were all there. The writing was indeed on the wall. The Achaemenid Persians are the main Persian empire that I think of. These guys had all of the greats. Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, all of those guys again, but with a 2 after their name. Xerxes is particularly famous for the fictional film 300, or for the real-life Greco-Persian War that the film is loosely related to. These guys ruled Babylon and the surrounding area for about 200 years, until, bam! Alexander the Great does more by the age of 30 than anyone will ever do again, ever. Which means that in 331 BCE, Babylon falls under the Macedonian Empire. So this is now Greek-ish. 8 years later, Alex dies, and one of his generals founds the Seleucid Empire, still kind of Greek-ish. Although, as Babylon is a bit too far east, the region is neglected in favour of more Greek cities. This makes it vulnerable to invasion by, hey, who's that coming over the hill? Oh no, bam! It's the Parthians. So the year is 141 BCE. The Pani tribe are about 100 years into their rule in Parthia, southeast of the Caspian Sea, modern-day Iran-Turkmenistan border, at least at the time of writing. You might recognise the Parthians from their hits such as Parthia versus Crassus in 53 BC, or Parthia versus Mark Antony in 36 BC. These guys were the big players in the time of the Romans, in the same way that the Persians were in their prime at the same time as the Greeks. They are ethnically distinct from the tribes from Parsua that became the Persians. However, in my mind, the Parthians are the middle child of the 3 great classical Persian empires that all belong to the same family. I mean that metaphorically, of course. They are specifically different families. However, in their own minds, the Parthians inherited the same empire from the Persians rather than forging it themselves from scratch. Their culture was initially Greek-leaning, with the sworn enemies of the Seleucids and Scythians. However, later in the rule, they reverted to more traditionally Iranian customs, art, religion, etc. Although we also notice a growing interaction with Indian and Chinese culture by way of trade and alliances. By about 145 BCE, the Parthian Empire conquers Babylon, whilst at the same time holding its empire's border on the Indus River. These guys were big, and they get about 350 years at the wheel in Babylon. I mentioned that the Parthians were the middle child of the Persian family. We had the Achaemenid Persians and the Parthians. Now in 224 AD, the youngest child is born, the Sasanian Persians. So they are an internal group rising to power and toppling the old guard of the Parthians, more like the victors of a civil war than an invading army. In this sense, is it really a different empire or just a change of dynasty? I'll leave that one for you to decide. The Sasanian Persians were now the major rival power to the Romans in the Levant and controlled all of modern-day Iraq, Iran, and parts of the South Arabian Peninsula. I talk a lot about religion, but so far I've not really discussed it in this context. Persia, of various empires, was traditionally dominated by local folklore beliefs and Zoroastrianism, although it began to be influenced by the Brahmanic and Buddhist teachings, and then later Jewish and Christian sects. Only towards, and indeed precipitating, the end of the Sasanian Persian Empire did we see the beginning of Muslim beliefs, as the empire was conquered by various Muslim caliphates. At this point, I will leave the history and pick it back up at a later date, but spoiler alert, the Muslim kingdoms get about 900 years before yet another empire with the name Persian returns in 1501 CE. Babylon, as a centre of learning, rises and falls between about 1000 BCE to 1000 CE. In that time, the Babylonians were a mixture of peoples and empires that might be better thought of as Iranian in ethnicity, culture, and heritage. So this makes me look like a bit of a fool, doesn't it? Because I've been largely ignoring the mathematics that came out of Babylon as a centre of learning throughout the first 50 episodes of the Hellenistic tradition, even though for a good portion of this time, Babylon and the surrounding area could have been considered Hellenistic under the rule of Alexander and the subsequent Seleucid Empire. Also, whilst tackling the Greek tradition, I've loosely waved my hands over that part of the map and called it all Babylonian maths. But the period when the region was under native Babylonian rule is relatively minor. What we have instead is an incredibly rich and varied history told around the focus of a reasonably unimportant city of Babylon. It didn't even have the hanging gardens, as they likely came from the city of Nineveh. In telling the story of mathematics through the lives and works of mathematicians whose names we know, we do miss out on a good chunk of this prehistoric Babylonian mathematics. So these are the famed clay tablets of Babylon. Conservative estimates suggest that there's around 500,000 of these extant tablets carved into clay that is fired and set. I could give you a quick list of some of the famous mathematical examples of clay tablets, such as the Plimpton 322, dealing with trigonometry and triples, the YBC 7289, dealing with square roots, BM 13901, dealing with quadratic equations, SI 47 with applied geometry, the Susa tablets with approximations of pi, and AO 6770, dealing with compound interest. But these are all reasonably anonymous numerical artifacts. So let's ask the question which so far I've spent 2,500 words not answering. Who were the first mathematicians from Babylon whose name we know? Nabu-rimanni, we think he lived around 491 BCE, of the reign of King Darius I from the Achaemenids, for those who are playing at home. He was from a long family tradition of scholars and mathematicians, and he himself was not only a scientist but also had a high-ranking social and religious office. We can even be reasonably confident of who his employer was. that is the Esagila Temple, or the Temple of Marduk. He's most famous as the inventor of what we now call System A astronomy. This saw a significant change from pre-existing astronomy as it moved from observational into predictive. System A focused on the motion of the moon and considered it to have two constant velocities to describe its motion, in the first half and the second half of its phases. This can account for the circular motion of the moon around the Earth, as the Earth also moves. It is a fairly blunt instrument of calculation, but interesting to note that he observed differing velocities and tried to account for this. He also calculated an incredibly accurate value for a synodic month. To clarify here, the difference between a synodic month and a sidereal month. A sidereal month, or normal month if you prefer, counts the number of days taken for the moon to move from 12 o'clock all the way around and back to 12 o'clock again in one orbit, whereas the synodic month measures the time between a new moon and the subsequent new moon, noticing that a new moon occurs when the moon is collinear with the Earth and Sun, and therefore this will be from 12 until about 1 o'clock, 13 hours later, as the Earth would have moved a bit in that time. Unlike with my analogy, Nabu-rimanni calculates it to be more accurate than the 13 hours. Indeed, he gives a value of 29.530614 days, compared with the true value of 29.530589 days. For those of you who struggle to divide by 24 and again by 60 and again by 60, the difference between these numbers is 2 seconds. Absolutely wild for a civilization that didn't have modern timekeeping methods. In fact, he reportedly used a water clock to make such an accurate prediction. Joke's on him though, because his calculation for the solar year was off by 26 minutes and 55 seconds. What a loser. We see the evidence of his work in the clay tablet VAT 209 in part 18, where he is listed as the author, although we should note that this text is dated around 500 years after when we believe he would have written the original. We also see him listed in some Greek history, including in Strabo, the geographer, or the Roman histories of Pliny the Elder. He's also given credit for refining the Saros cycle, which is an 18-year predictive model of solar and lunar eclipses. And given that I have only said about 500 words on Nabu-rimanni, you can see why I gave such a long introduction to the history. But as we still have some time together today, let's turn our attention to the second mathematician who is very much part of the same story. Kidinu lived some 200 years after Nabu-rimanni, very much during the Seleucid period. Although we could call Kidinu Babylonian, we believe he worked for a rival university in Sippar, which is about 70 kilometers north of Babylon. I can't tell you about his family or where he was born, but I can tell you that he was executed towards the latter part of his life. But curiously, I can't tell you why. If you like, you can assume that this is not a gap in the historical record, but rather a court injunction placed around the discussion of the case, as it's still an ongoing matter. Having been brought up with a system of astronomy defined by Nabu-rimanni, Kidinu sought to refine this into a better model. He called it System B, not unlike the way I would introduce kinematics in my A-level classes. System A to System B moves between a constant velocity to constant acceleration model, in that Kidinu thought the moon had two phases of velocity that were both linear acceleration or deceleration, creating a zigzag pattern. This is naturally more difficult to calculate, but allows for a more accurate prediction for the next new moon. If you thought System A was accurate with a 2-second deviation from the synodic month, Kidinu claps back with 1/10 of a second of error. His calculation for the length of a year was so accurate that later scholars could use his data to recognise that the solar year and lunar year were not only different, but moving apart, allowing for an understanding of a 19-year metonic cycle. There is disagreement in the academic community about whether Kidinu had discovered the precession of the equinoxes, that is, where the Earth's axis wobbles slightly as it moves. We spoke before about how Hipparchus was the first person to discover this back in episode 31. Generally, we think that Kidinu did not know about it. However, it was his meticulously accurate data that allowed Hipparchus to discover the phenomenon. We do have extant evidence of his life. This is in the ACT 122 tablet, which is described as the standard work of Kidinu. But we also see him in the works of Pliny the Elder, Ptolemy, and of course Hipparchus. But more generally, throughout the history of maths I've been telling so far, we have the general vibes that the ancient Babylonians had done everything astronomy-based earlier and better than anything the Greeks had done. And largely it's Kidinu who we're talking about here. So, 2 mathematicians for today, both very short and very sweet, and a good focal point for discussing my failings at understanding the scope and depth of the, quote, Babylonians. Next time, we shall be turning our attention again to a mathematician who will be the focal point of discussing a wider tradition of history. Whilst arguably a mathematician in their own right, he is mainly standing at the tip of a series of centuries of mathematical work by the Jainists. I am, of course, speaking of Umasawati. And I shall tell you what he said next time on the Mathematicians Podcast. As ever, if you can't wait until next time, please follow me on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod, where you can hear how excited I am every time I register a new sequence with the OEIS. Spoiler alert, I now have my own triangle. And speaking of next time, this will probably be a much larger gap than normal. As things stand, I'm expecting my new daughter to be born any time in the next 4 weeks, at which point I will likely go dormant until the sun rises on my spare mental energy. If you'd like to support me through this time, then don't forget to go to my tips page at ko-fi.com. Link is in the description. So, until next time, goodbye! The music today is Dance Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.